All right, welcome to PowerPoint number 8, our lesson for quotation marks. This is our final punctuation PowerPoint, and it is a bit of a doozy. Uh, there's a lot to get with quotation marks, so we'll go ahead and get started. First thing we're going to look at is we've got 5 rules on when to use quotation marks. So, rule number 1, you want to use quotation marks when you actually have a direct quotation. That is another person's exact words incorporated into your writing. So think of dialogue or think of quotes that you would find in your sources. You always want to use quotation marks at the beginning and end of the quoted material. You want to capitalize the first word of the quote only if you're quoting a full sentence. And then only at the start of that complete sentence, even if you interrupt it. If you're not quoting complete sentence, you do not you do not put the first word in capital letters. So let's look at some examples. We have Mr. and Mrs. Allen said, we refuse to use that pesticide. Okay, we have quotation marks at the beginning, we've got quotation marks at the end, as you see highlighted in yellow. Mr. and Mrs. Allen said, that would be an example of something we would call a dialogue tag. That's very important. What you see with that comma in relation to that tag and that quotation mark, we'll get into a little bit more detail with it later, but I wanted you to see that that dialogue tag can come at any point. It can come at the beginning, it can come at the end, and it can come at the middle. This last one where it's in the middle, you can see how we do not have the E in especially capitalized because it's just a continuation of the previous sentence. But up in the first example, the we is capitalized because it's the start of a full sentence that is being quoted. Rule number 2, you don't want to use quotes with indirect quotations. If you paraphrase or summarize what somebody says, you don't use quotation marks. So, according to their statement to the local papers, the Allens refused to use the pesticide. Okay, we're not quoting the Allens saying, we refuse to use pesticide. We're saying that they said it. It's a paraphrasing, so we don't use quotation marks. If you are using a quotation within a quotation, you can do this, but you need to use single quotation marks for the enclosed quote. So here's an example. The agricultural reporter for the newspaper explained, when I talked to the Allens last week, they said, we refuse to use that pesticide. So here, the agricultural reporter is explaining his conversation that he had with the Allens, and then he's quoting the Allens. So when he uses the Allens' actual quote, he's going to include this single quotation mark to indicate that those are the Allens' words. Here at the end, it looks a little funky, but we've got the single quotation mark ending the Allens' quote, and then we've got the double quotation mark ending the reporter's quote. You can make minor changes to a quotation. You might take a couple of words out using ellipses. You might add a word or perhaps change a small part like a verb tense or a pronoun tense. So here's a couple of examples. If our original sentence includes the entire big long quotation that you see from the welfare agency representative, we might not want to use the whole thing. So we could use ellipses to make that quote shorter. We are unable to help every family because we don't have the funds to do so. So you can see here that this ellipses is replacing that we'd like to help, which was in the original quote and is now not. Down here, we are using part of the welfare agency representative's quote, but we wanted to change this to from we would to they would because it makes more sense the way this sentence is being presented. In that case, you would just put your they would in brackets to indicate that it's a minor change from what the original quote said. You want to put our final quotation usage rule. You want to put it in use quotation marks for titles. You want to use quotation marks for short and minor works or things that are parts of something bigger. So many examples: short stories, poems, songs, essays, speeches, etc. These are all small minor works. They're part of something bigger. That short story is part of a collection. That song is part of an album. The essay might be part of it was published in a journal article, in a journal or a newspaper, so it would go in quotation marks. The opposite of that, if you have a major work, you want to use italics. So anything that contains smaller parts is going to be in italics. So the title of a full book, it's going to have chapters, so it has smaller parts. A play, a newspaper, a magazine. Newspapers and magazines would have smaller parts. They have articles within them. Those articles would be in quotation marks. Films, albums, titles of major artworks would all go in italics because they're major pieces. On to our punctuation rules. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought we only had 5. Apparently we had 6. So, if you want to use quotation marks for single words, you should only use quotation marks for single words if you want to use them ironically, or if you want to show that you're using them in a unique or unusual way. So for example, the Great March of Progress has left millions impoverished and hungry. Okay, in this instance, based on the meaning of the sentence, we can see that progress is being used ironically. It's being used there in quotation marks to show that it's not really progress if it's left millions impoverished and hungry. Those quotation marks show that we don't mean progress literally, or that we're somehow questioning the use of the word progress. Now we're on to punctuating quotation marks. Okay, rule number 1. If you have a standard dialogue tag, some sort of introductory phrase or an independent clause, you want to use a comma. So as Natchez explains, comma, quotation marks, and then complete your quotation. That's the basic, most simple way to punctuate quotation marks. If you have an independent clause that starts it off instead of a dialogue tag, you would use a colon before your quotation marks, as in the example that you see in front of you. If instead of that colon you had a period, you would then have a dropped quote. If instead of that colon you had a comma, you would have a comma splice. So if you're using an independent clause to introduce a quote, you've got to use a colon. Now I'll tell you, you should not use this construction often. Most of the time, you're better off using this one. Create a dependent clause or an introductory phrase or a dialogue tag. That's a much more smooth way to integrate your quotations. If you punctuate it this way with a colon, it's grammatically acceptable, but you shouldn't do it too often. If every single one of your quotes is introduced this way, it makes you look like an immature writer who doesn't know how to integrate quotation marks, or doesn't know how to integrate quotations into your own thoughts. If you have commas or periods at the end of a quote, they will go inside the quotation marks unless there's a parenthetical reference. So we have 3 examples here. The first one, I never remember a face. That's the end of a sentence, so we have a period. Notice that it's inside the quotation marks. The second example, we have a quotation in the middle of a sentence, so it happens to necessitate a comma. That comma goes inside the quotation marks. This last example, obviously we have a parenthetical reference, so this is the one instance where the punctuation would go at the end, not inside. I will tell you that you will occasionally see this done opposite. You'll see the period or comma outside of the quotation marks, and that is because either they're doing it wrong or, strangely enough, they're British. The British rule actually is the exact opposite. It says to put them outside. So if you see it done wrong, you can try to figure out whether they're British or whether they just don't know what they're doing. 4th punctuation rule. Opposite of commas and periods, if you have a colon or a semicolon, it actually goes outside the closing quotation mark. So here we've got 2 examples. I think this is pretty easy to spot. If you put that semicolon or that colon inside the quotation marks, it would look weird. So anytime you're using one of them, either to add another independent clause or to create a list of what you've just said you're doing, that would go on the outside. One more, a little bit more complicated rule for punctuating quotations is if you have a dash, a question mark, or an exclamation point, and that really depends. If the punctuation needs to be with a quoted material, if the material being quoted is actually a question or an exclamation, then it would go inside. If the punctuation belongs to the whole sentence, it goes on the outside. And let's take a couple of examples so we can see what we're talking about. So Philip asked, do you need this book? Since do you need this book is a question, that question mark goes inside the quotation marks. You don't need another period on the outside of that. That last quotation mark does the job for the entire sentence. The opposite scenario of that, does Dr. Lim always say to her students, you must work harder? You must work harder, not a question. So it does not get the quotation mark. However, does Dr. Lim always say to her students this? That's the question. The question mark goes on the outside. Very similar in the two exclamation point examples. We won, we won. That's clearly an exclamation. Therefore, the exclamation mark goes inside the quotation marks. And the opposite, I can't believe you actually like that song, Call Me Maybe. Call Me Maybe, just a song title, not an exclamation. Therefore, we need to put that exclamation mark on the outside of the sentence to show that we are showing our exasperation. I can't believe you actually like that song. That's the end. Now, you are legally bound to punctuate correctly in all of the papers that you will be turning in to me this year.